On one of the Tokyo subway lines, an automatic monitoring system recorded a short-term deviation in parameters in a service tunnel between two stations. Such signals were usually attributed to technical noise and not considered an incident. The operator on duty saw the mark on the screen a few seconds after it appeared. The indicators had already returned to normal, and train traffic continued as usual without delays or stops. At that time, there were no reports of malfunctions, complaints from drivers, or requests from passengers. The line was operating reliably and did not raise any suspicions from the technical service. Around the same time, one of the platform's surveillance cameras captured a man wearing a dark work jacket. His clothing bore no signs of affiliation with the metro or any contractors. He was at the end of the platform and did not try to approach the train. His behavior was different from that of a normal passenger, since he did not look at the board and did not react to the arrival of the train. Cameras showed the man heading toward a service area located behind a technical fence, access to which was intended exclusively for station personnel. This area was used for servicing engineering systems and remained closed during normal times, with entry controlled and not open to the public. The recording shows that the service door was open, but the moment it opened was not recorded by any surveillance camera on the platform. The man walked inside without hesitation and disappeared from view, after which his movements were no longer recorded by the station's cameras. That man never appeared on any of the adjacent platforms or in any of the line's carriages again that day. In the first hours after the incident was recorded, the event was not associated with anything unusual. Similar episodes with open service doors periodically occurred due to human error or technical failures. The camera footage was reviewed selectively. The man was not identified as a Metro employee, but no signs of a direct violation of order were recorded at that time. His demeanor did not appear fussy or secretive. He moved calmly and confidently, as if he knew the location of the service areas and the order of access to them. Access logs for this period did not show any personnel entering through this door, and electronic keys were not used at that time. This meant that the door had either been left open previously, or access had been gained in a way that was not recorded by the standard accounting system. The station's technical service did not receive any signals about unauthorized entry. The sensors on the door did not work. Until the end of the shift, the duty personnel did not attach any importance to the incident, since train traffic was not disrupted and no consequences were recorded. Only later, when comparing the video recordings, did attention come to the fact that the man never appeared on any of the station exit cameras. He did not leave the platform through the turnstiles or transfer to other lines. His route ended inside the service area. It was this gap between the input and the absence of an output that became the first sign that the event did not fit within the framework of an ordinary technical episode. After video footage showed the man entering the service door and not reappearing at the station exits, the recording was forwarded to the line's technical department. At this stage, the situation was not yet considered a disappearance. It was treated as a possible access violation or metering failure because the man's identity and the purpose of his actions remained unknown. Security checked the cameras on the platform and in the adjacent corridors, but none captured the man's return to the passenger area. There were no footage of the turnstiles or stairs where he could have exited. The route ended inside the service area, and this was the first sign of an unusual incident. Further inspection revealed that after the service door, a network of technical rooms, cable corridors, and service passages begins. Some areas are not equipped with video surveillance, and in some zones, there is no stable connection, so a person can move around there without being tracked or quickly traced. The work logs revealed that there were no scheduled operations in the deep sectors of the station that day. No contractors had registered, and no service requests had been opened. This ruled out official presence and reinforced the theory that an outsider had gained access through a method not reflected in the standard accounting system. Electronic key logs did not show the use of access rights on the service door within the required time frame, meaning the door was either opened in advance or it was opened mechanically without the use of a key. The sensors did not activate, and this indicated a vulnerability in an area that was considered closed but was not actually monitored. Line management authorized a preliminary inspection of nearby service areas by station personnel. They checked areas where someone might accidentally linger, including storage rooms, electrical panels, and communications rooms. No traces of human presence were found, the equipment was intact, and no signs of an accident or conflict were recorded. However, the lack of results only confirmed that he had gone deeper. The next stage of the inspection expanded to the ventilation and cable tray maintenance corridors. Conditions there deteriorated, with lighting in places absent and the floor covered in dust and small debris. These are the surfaces that typically leave footprints, allowing one to at least roughly reconstruct the direction of movement without video. In one of the corridors, employees discovered a trail of footprints. The pattern didn't match the standard footwear worn by staff. The tracks ran smoothly and without abrupt stops, indicating confident movement. They led to a connecting passageway that was listed on the plans as old and rarely used, but was barely mentioned in current instructions. A comparison with the diagrams revealed that this passage connects the active section of the line with a technical tunnel that was decommissioned several years ago. It was formally considered closed, but physically remained part of the underground system. It is precisely these sections that most often become blind spots because they are not monitored daily and there are almost no cameras. At the entrance to the old tunnel, the locking mechanism was found to be in the open position. There were no signs of forced entry, and the fastenings were undamaged. It looked as if the passage had been opened as usual and not closed. It was not possible to determine exactly when this happened, because regular monitoring of this point was not provided for by the regulations. Inside the tunnel, the tracks continued on a dusty surface, then disappeared onto a concrete surface where prints don't stick well. There was no lighting. Communication with the control center became unstable, and station personnel were not allowed to continue without specialist escort. Therefore, the inspection was stopped and reported as the discovery of signs of intrusion. Following this, the issue of involving transport security and emergency services was raised, as the presence of a person in a closed tunnel poses a risk not only to the person, but also to the line's movement, especially if they reach utilities containing high voltage and signaling equipment. Even a brief intervention could cause disruptions. A check of adjacent stations began simultaneously, searching for matches using cameras. However, the man in the work jacket did not appear on adjacent platforms or crossings. This strengthened the theory that he was not moving through the passenger area, but remained in the technical environment, where routes can lead far from public spaces. At this stage, the report first indicated that this was an unknown person whose whereabouts had not been established after entering the service area. Formally, the disappearance had not yet been recorded because there had been no statement from relatives and the identity had not been established, but the structure of events already corresponded to a search incident. A check of police and medical records for that day yielded no matches. No one had reported a missing person matching the description. This created uncertainty, because without an identity, it is impossible to assess motives, health status, and potential risks, and therefore impossible to construct a probable scenario for their actions. The internal investigation focused on how exactly he was able to approach the service door without being an employee, as well as why the door was open. To do this, they reviewed staff round records, shift logs, and security reports. The documents found no mention of a faulty lock or the need to keep the door open. Next, we checked the mechanical part of the door. Wear was noticeable, and the closing latch worked inconsistently. This could lead to a situation where the door remains loosely closed and opens when pressed. This type of defect is not always detected by the sensors if the system is configured to register only full opening and closing. This conclusion didn't explain the man's confident demeanor. He walked as if he knew the door would give way, and as if he already knew that a camera-free corridor began beyond. This reinforced the suspicion that he possessed knowledge of the station's internal structure, a knowledge typically reserved for metro employees or contractors, but his clothing didn't support either of these statuses. Line management decided to temporarily restrict access to some service areas and conduct an extensive inspection of the old tunnel with the involvement of specialists. Before proceeding, a risk assessment was required, as closed sections could be damaged, flooded, or contain hazardous areas where unprepared movement could lead to injury and disorientation. The plans for the old tunnel showed several branches, some of which led to ventilation shafts and technical areas, others to communication hubs. The precise plans were rarely updated, meaning that even specialists didn't always have a complete picture of the current state of the underground section, especially if it wasn't officially in use. As preparations for the inspection progressed, it became clear that some key points on the diagrams did not correspond with reality. Some passages were blocked by temporary structures, while others were open. This confirmed that unofficial work or passages could have been carried out in the tunnel that were not reflected in the documentation and could have been known to a limited circle of people. That same day, a search party examined the first few dozen meters of the tunnel without finding a person. However, they did find fresh abrasions on a metal handrail and footprints on a damp section of the floor, indicating a recent presence and matching the direction of a previously discovered trail of footprints. Further on, there was an area with increased ventilation noise. It was difficult to hear footsteps or voices there. There was no lighting, and the floor surface varied. In such conditions, a person could pass unnoticed even by the group, especially if they moved forward and did not return to the cameras and exits onto the platform. During the inspection, another fact was discovered. On one of the technical panels, there was a trace of a glove or fabric. It looked fresh and was located at hand level. This could indicate that someone had leaned on or checked the surface while passing by. There was no direct connection with the man, but taken together, this confirmed activity in the zone. After recording these signs, it was decided to expand the search to the ventilation branches, because this is where blind spots most often occur, where a person can turn off, become disoriented, and not find their way back, especially if they don't know where the exit is and are navigating only by intuition. At this stage, the line's dispatch service was brought in to help synchronize train movements and eliminate the risk of unauthorized personnel entering the active tunnel. Any work near the tracks requires strict coordination, so the search began to depend on windows of time when it was safe to enter certain areas. Time and access restrictions dramatically slowed the speed of the search. Each inspection required approval. Furthermore, some routes were physically difficult to navigate, with narrow staircases and elevation changes posing a risk of injury to the searchers themselves. This further demonstrated that an unprepared person could quickly find themselves in difficult-to-recover situations. Despite the inspection, by the end of the day the man's whereabouts had not been established. It was confirmed that he had not entered the station through the passenger areas and had not been seen at any nearby facilities. This left two options. Either he was still in the technical infrastructure, or an incident had occurred in an area that had not yet been inspected. In the absence of any results, line management filed a separate report on the possible intrusion, which was forwarded to the transport police. This report indicated the risk of an unauthorized person being in the metro who could not be found and whose actions were unknown. This situation required external documentation, even without a missing person report. It was from this point on that the story ceased to be an internal inspection of the station and turned into a full-fledged incident, where the key question was simply, who was this person and how could he disappear within a system formally controlled by cameras, sensors, and regulations? After the report was submitted to the transport police, a joint task force was formed, but initial actions remained limited as there was no formally confirmed missing person, no documents or name were available, and all evidence was based on video recordings and indirect signs of intrusion into the service infrastructure. Police requested expanded access to the Metro's archives of tunnel and utility room plans, but it quickly became clear that some of the documentation pertained to previous stages of construction and did not reflect changes that had occurred during operation and repair. Some plans were kept in paper form and had not been updated for years, meaning that the actual condition of underground sections could differ significantly from that indicated in the official plans. When comparing the maps with the actual inspection, discrepancies were discovered. The diagrams were missing partitions and temporary barriers that were installed later, and unofficial passages that appeared during the repair work were not taken into account. This complicated the search, because even with a plan, it was impossible to determine exactly where a person might turn if they found themselves in the old tunnel without an escort or lighting. Special attention was paid to ventilation shafts, some of which connected service corridors with other sections of the line and could be used as a bypass route. Such areas are rarely patrolled and are practically not monitored by cameras. An inspection of the shafts revealed that some hatches were not sealed and the fastenings showed signs of wear, but it was impossible to determine how long ago they had been opened, since there was no regulation for regularly inspecting such elements. At one site, searchers discovered footprints on the dusty surface of a metal deck. They matched the size and pattern of previously discovered footprints, confirming that the individual had continued moving deeper into the structure. The tracks were arranged as if the person had walked confidently and without stopping. There were no signs of panic or chaotic movements, which ruled out sudden disorientation at this stage. However, further on, the flooring gave way to a smooth surface, where the prints disappeared completely, and this again interrupted the route, leaving the search party without landmarks. After identifying matching footprints, a decision was made to reconstruct the man's possible route using the principle of sequential deepening. To do this, specialists compared the location of the prints with archival tunnel diagrams to determine which branches could be accessed without dismantling the fences. The analysis showed that within the old tunnel, there are at least 3 traffic directions that were not reflected in the current station plans. These passages were formed in different years during temporary works and were later not included in the operational documentation. One of these passages led to a technical collector for servicing cable lines. Access there was officially closed, but physically it remained passable. It was there that the logical trajectory of movement led, based on the location of the tracks and the configuration of the space. Upon inspection of the sewer entrance, traces of recent contact with surfaces were discovered. Scuffs remained on the metal frame, and partial footprints were recorded on a dusty section of the floor, indicating that a person had passed through here relatively recently. Inside the collector, conditions rapidly deteriorated. Noise levels increased due to ventilation, lighting was completely absent, and the space became narrower. Such an environment quickly leads to disorientation in an unprepared person. Experts estimate that without a light source and a clear understanding of the route, a person can walk a significant distance in the wrong direction without realizing it, especially if the tunnel has gentle curves and elevation changes. There was no communication in this area. Any radio communications were interrupted, so the personnel could not maintain constant contact with each other, which further complicated the search operations. A torn warning sign was found in one of the sewer branches, lying on the floor and showing fresh signs of damage, a fact not mentioned in previous reports and indicating recent physical impact. The sign was located in a place where the collector divided into 2 narrow passages. Without markings, the choice of direction became random, and this significantly increased the risk of ending up in a dead-end zone. An inspection of the dead ends revealed that some of them end in technical niches with no exit. Such areas are not intended for people to stay in and do not allow for turning around without physical contact with the walls. In one of the niches, traces of contact with the walls at shoulder level were recorded. The nature of the contamination matched the fabric of the jacket recorded on the video recording. This did not provide direct evidence, but strengthened the connection with the previously discovered fingerprints. Further advance along the collector required special permission, as the area was located below the drainage system level and was at risk of flooding. Search operations were temporarily suspended to assess safety. During the break, specialists compiled a map of the areas already inspected and noted that a significant portion of the man's route passed through an area that had never been monitored by cameras or sensors. This meant that the entire critical section of events took place outside of digital recording, and reconstruction of what happened was only possible through indirect physical evidence. When the inspection resumed, the search team focused on the drainage area, since it was there that several technical passages logically converged. Near the unit, traces of water were found on the floor and partially washed-out footprints, indicating that a person had passed through here before the last drain and could have found himself in a dramatically changed environment. Experts noted that in such conditions, landmarks disappear almost completely, and the sound of water and ventilation distorts the perception of direction of movement. At this point, the route reconstruction was interrupted again, the physical traces disappeared, and the space beyond consisted of a system of narrow channels and service compartments. According to the technical service, this section was the most dangerous in the entire old tunnel area and had previously been reported as problematic. From that point on, the investigation effectively shifted from searching for the individual to analyzing how the infrastructure could have absorbed his movements without the possibility of reconstructing the events. Once the hazardous area was identified as a key area, emergency service engineers were brought in to assess the condition of the drainage channels and determine whether it was possible to safely move inside without the risk of collapse or a sudden influx of water. The inspection revealed that some of the channels have an uneven slope. Under certain conditions, water can accumulate and quickly drain into lower sections. Such changes in level are not always recorded by the central system unless they reach threshold values. This meant that a person inside could experience a sudden change in the environment, making the way back difficult or completely blocked. Technical reports noted that such zones were designed without regard for human presence. They are intended solely for maintenance and do not have emergency evacuation facilities. As the search party progressed, traces of increased humidity and areas with silt deposits were recorded, indicating that water flows here regularly and is capable of washing away light objects and footprints. In one of these places, a piece of dark-colored fabric was discovered. It was stuck in a metal grate and did not match the materials used by the staff. The find was recorded, but direct identification was not possible. A comparison with the video footage showed that the color and texture of the fabric were similar to the man's jacket, but without DNA analysis, it was impossible to confirm the connection. Time was needed to conduct the analysis, so search operations in this area were temporarily suspended. At the same time, specialists checked possible exits from the drainage system, some of which led to technical wells located outside the station's passenger area. An inspection of these wells revealed no signs of human exit. The lids were in the closed position and showed no signs of recent opening. This narrowed the search area to the interior of the system, where a person could remain undetected. The reports emphasized that under such conditions, the likelihood of independent exit without assistance is minimal. An important factor was the man's lack of lighting. No flashlight or other light source was visible on the video recording. In dark and noisy corridors, orientation without light deteriorates sharply after just a few minutes. Engineers noted that even experienced personnel use safety equipment and constant communication when inspecting such areas. In the case of the unknown man, nothing similar was recorded. This strengthened the theory that he found himself in an environment that was not intended for human habitation. By this point, the search party had officially acknowledged that further progress required changing the status of the operation. After analyzing the conditions in the drainage area, the search team concluded that the situation was beyond the scope of a standard infrastructure check, and the risk to a potential unauthorized person was assessed as high. Therefore, the decision was made to forward the information to the Metro Coordination Center for a review of the operation's status. The Coordination Center reviewed the data collected over the previous hours, the lack of a person logging out of the system, and the physical signs found inside the tunnels indicated that the incident could be life-threatening, but formal confirmation was impossible without identifying the person. The lack of a name and an official missing person report became the key limitation. According to regulations, emergency search operations are launched only in the presence of a specific individual. In this case, the only evidence was the fact of penetration and disappearance within the technical environment. As a result, the operation continued to be classified as an extended infrastructure security check rather than a rescue operation, which directly impacted the amount of resources available and the number of specialists who could be deployed. Despite this, line management allowed inspections of the most dangerous sections to continue within permitted time windows. Each advance was coordinated separately with the dispatch service to avoid any impact on train traffic. Such restrictions significantly slowed down the work. Some routes could only be surveyed at night or during short technological breaks, which reduced the actual search time. Engineers have noted that under such conditions, the likelihood of finding a person alive decreases with each hour, especially if they are in an area with high humidity and no lighting. These assessments were reflected in official documents and internal calculations, but were not shared outside the department to avoid premature conclusions. For metro passengers, the situation remained unnoticed. The line continued to operate as usual without announcements or restrictions. Outwardly, nothing indicated that a complex operation to search for an unknown person was underway beneath the platforms and tunnels. It is precisely this difference between public stability and hidden processes that has become one of the features of the whole history. The man disappeared inside a system that outwardly continued to function as usual and showed no signs of an emergency. Following an internal review of the operation's status, the Metro's management decided to continue the infrastructure survey in the background, without public announcement or additional resources, with the primary focus being on train safety and minimizing disruption to line operations. The search team focused on areas where indirect signs of human presence had previously been recorded. These zones were marked as priority areas, but access to them remained limited due to the complex design and the lack of permanent technological windows. Engineers pointed out that the drainage and ventilation systems were designed as standalone elements and were not intended for human habitation. There were no exit signs or emergency lighting inside. In such conditions, even a short stay without preparation can lead to complete disorientation, especially if a person does not realize that he is in a closed, technical environment. An analysis of the tunnel configuration showed that some routes form closed loops. A person can move for a long time without approaching the exit, while physically remaining within the same station. This explained why the absence of an exit was not accompanied by the discovery of a body or objects on the active routes. One internal report noted that such a structure poses a particular danger to outsiders who are not familiar with the logic behind the system's construction. As the archives were examined, it became clear that some infrastructure changes were carried out without subsequent map updates, temporary passages became permanent, and official routes were closed. These discrepancies made even expert maps conditional and did not guarantee a complete understanding of the real state of the underground space. As a result, each new check essentially started from scratch. Searchers could not rely on a single, reliable plan. Particular attention was paid to the possibility of a person entering the area of moving mechanisms or technical tanks. Such areas are rarely inspected and can be completely hidden from view. However, no direct evidence of such a scenario was found, and not a single emergency signal or failure was recorded. This reinforced the feeling that events were unfolding without any sudden disruptions to the system. The reports emphasized that these types of incidents are the most difficult to investigate, leaving no traces in logs and not triggering automatic responses. Over time, the active phase of the survey began to fade away. The main dangerous areas were checked within acceptable limits, and no new data appeared. The line's management decided to keep the materials in the archive and return to them when necessary or when new information emerges. Formally, the case continued to be listed as an unresolved access incident rather than a confirmed disappearance. The lack of an established identity remained a key obstacle. Internal discussions increasingly focused on analyzing systemic vulnerabilities rather than the man's specific actions. After completing the active phase of the survey, the investigative team determined that none of the surveyed areas yielded direct evidence of the man's whereabouts. The lack of findings, coupled with the lack of a way out of the system, confirmed that a key section of his route was located in an area that was either inaccessible for verification or not reflected in existing maps. Service reports indicated that such zones exist on every major metro line. They are formed from a combination of old temporary connection tunnels and technical compartments that are physically preserved but are not subject to regular monitoring and scheduled inspections. A review of archival documents revealed that some of these sections on this line had not been reviewed for more than 10 years. Changes to the infrastructure were recorded fragmentarily and were not always transmitted to the central database. This meant that the actual state of the underground space differed from what was considered relevant in the operational plans, and the search team may simply not have known about the existence of individual passages or niches. An internal analysis confirmed that the man was able to access a segment of the system that is formally listed as closed but physically remains accessible. Access there is not accompanied by automatic signals and does not cause line interruptions. In this scenario, its further movement could not be recorded by cameras or sensors, and the absence of accidents excluded the automatic attraction of technical services. The report specifically noted that such conditions make it impossible to accurately determine the moment of the incident, and it is impossible to determine where the person became disoriented or encountered a critical situation. Because of this, the investigation could not move to the next stage. There was no point from which to build a chain of cause and effect. Formally, the case continued to be listed as an unauthorized access incident with no identified person, a status that limited the use of search and rescue procedures. All collected materials were systematized and transferred for storage, with a note about the possibility of resuming work when new information becomes available. At this stage, active operations ceased, and the situation was recorded as a case of disappearance within the technical infrastructure with no confirmed outcome. Following the cessation of active inspections, Metro Management conducted an internal audit of compliance with access regulations for service areas, paying particular attention to the condition of doors, locks, and sensors on platforms and in passageways that could potentially be used by unauthorized persons. The audit revealed that access control systems at a number of sites were operating inconsistently. Some sensors only recorded the door being fully opened and did not respond to partial movement of the door leaf, allowing entry without recording the event in the log. At the station where the man's entry was recorded, a similar feature was present. This was confirmed by a technical report drawn up after the incident, and explained why the moment the door opened was not recorded in any accounting system. Further investigation revealed that routine testing of these elements was conducted selectively and did not cover all service passages, with priority given to high-traffic areas and peripheral areas being tested less frequently. As a result, part of the infrastructure was actually operational, but without a guarantee of correct recording of events, which created conditions for undetected penetration. These findings were reflected in the internal report, but did not become the basis for an immediate change in regulations. The incident was not formally classified as an emergency. At the same time, Transport Police completed a check of missing persons databases for the relevant period. No matches with the man's description were found. The lack of missing person reports made it impossible to link the incident to a specific person and to transfer the case to the criminal realm. This meant that the investigation was limited to the internal security of the metro and did not receive expanded powers. The reports noted that this situation is rare but not unique to large underground systems, where some events may occur without being recorded due to the nature of the infrastructure. Security services have noted that without an identity, it is impossible to determine the motives for entry, the person's state of health, or the person's level of training. This excluded the possibility of constructing a probable scenario of his actions after entering the technical zone. The internal analysis was limited to a description of the identified vulnerabilities and a list of potentially dangerous areas. The inspection recommended strengthening monitoring of the old tunnels and revising the frequency of inspections of service passages. However, these recommendations were general in nature and were not accompanied by a specific implementation plan. In practice, this meant that changes could be postponed indefinitely. The incident materials were included in the closed archive of the security service as an example of unauthorized access with an uncertain outcome. The incident materials were included in a closed archive of the Metro Security Service. Access to them was limited to an internal circle of specialists, and the documents were used exclusively for vulnerability analysis and personnel training, while no active actions to continue the search were planned. These materials were periodically returned to during training sessions, with staff analyzing the sequence of events and noting key points where recording proved impossible. However, each such analysis resulted in the same conclusions, without the emergence of new information. In the intervening period, no external agency has provided any information that could be linked to this case, and there have been no reports of personal belongings, bodies, or witnesses being found, confirming the absence of traces outside the metro infrastructure. Checks by the transport police did not reveal any matches with unidentified individuals admitted to medical facilities or detained in other areas of the city. This meant that the person did not leave the metro system through official exits and did not appear in public spaces after a recorded entry into the service area. The absence of such data reinforced the theory that subsequent events took place exclusively within the technical infrastructure. The latest service reports indicated that without identification, it was impossible to determine the exact moment and nature of the incident. It was also noted that infrastructural changes and natural wear and tear over time erase possible physical traces. Experts noted that over time, the likelihood of detecting new physical traces within technical infrastructure significantly decreases. Constant humidity, vibration, and maintenance work lead to the destruction of surfaces and the erasure of any markers of human presence. Repeated inspections of the same areas could no longer provide the same information that was available in the first days after the incident. Environmental changes made it impossible to accurately compare previously recorded signs with the current state of the tunnels. Based on these assessments, the Metro's management concluded that resuming active search operations without new information would be ineffective and would create additional risks for personnel. The official documents recorded the decision to preserve the materials in the archive and return to them only upon receipt of external data that could be directly related to the case. Thus, the incident was finally confirmed as an unsolved disappearance within the Metro's technical infrastructure, with no established identity or confirmed outcome. After the case was archived, the Metro's security service conducted a random audit of similar service areas at other stations along the line, with the goal of determining whether there were areas with a comparable level of uncontrolled access and lack of event recording. The audit results showed that a number of stations contained old technical corridors that had been decommissioned. Their condition and level of control largely coincided with the zone where the disappearance occurred, indicating the systemic nature of the vulnerabilities identified. The reports emphasized that these zones were not considered a priority from a safety perspective, as they were not used in daily operations and did not directly impact train traffic. This approach has been developing for years and is based on the assumption that closed infrastructure is of no interest to outsiders. The incident with the unknown man was the first documented case that called this assumption into question. However, the lack of a specific victim and direct consequences for the system did not lead to an immediate revision of the control policy. Post-incident investigations were limited by acceptable costs and did not involve a complete overhaul of the old infrastructure. Security teams focused on eliminating the most obvious defects that could lead to repeated unauthorized access. First of all, the mechanical components on the service doors were reinforced, worn latches were replaced, and the door position sensors were adjusted. However, these measures only affected those areas that were in active use and regularly visible to personnel. Old corridors and tunnels that had been decommissioned were left outside the modernization program. Their condition continued to be assessed as secondary since they were not used in daily operations and did not directly affect train traffic. This approach maintained the previous control model, in which infrastructure was divided into visible and hidden. The latter formally existed, but was in fact excluded from the system of regular inspections. Internal analysts pointed out that it is precisely in these zones that the greatest risk arises, since any events occurring there are not recorded automatically and are discovered only after the fact. The lack of new incidents in reporting created a sense of stability, but experts noted that this reflected limited monitoring rather than a real reduction in threats. The story of the disappearance of an unknown man was seen as confirmation of this problem, demonstrating that a person could penetrate a technical environment and disappear without causing a single system failure. Despite this, the conclusions remained within the framework of expert discussions and were not transformed into mandatory regulatory changes. In its final report, the Metro's management stated that the incident had no impact on passenger safety, and that there were no emergency signals causing delays or equipment damage. Therefore, the incident was not recognized as grounds for a major review of underground infrastructure control policies. This conclusion made it possible to formally close the issue of an expanded inspection of all old tunnels and technical corridors, since the costs of such measures were assessed as disproportionate in the absence of direct damage or confirmed victims. The official documents emphasized that existing regulations were considered sufficient to prevent risks, and that the incident was classified as a rare combination of circumstances rather than a systemic threat. This decision consolidated the previous model of focusing on operational areas, while closed and rarely used areas remain outside the priority list for regular monitoring. The case materials were permanently moved to a restricted security archive, where they were kept as a reference case and were not considered an active investigation. The use of these materials was limited to internal briefings and analysis of typical errors in risk assessment in the technical environment. New employees were introduced to the case in the context of training sessions, but the lack of an ending and a specific person made it abstract and difficult to apply to practical scenarios. Over time, the story came to be seen as one of many unresolved cases that exist in large infrastructure systems. The lack of external attention and public resonance reduced the likelihood of a return to active action. No unit initiated a re-examination of the areas where the man was believed to be located. The actual condition of the tunnels continued to change under the influence of time and operational factors. This further reduced the chances of detecting traces that could remain in the first days after the incident. Over time, specialists noted that each subsequent survey of the technical zones yielded less and less information. Environmental changes occurred constantly. Equipment was partially serviced, surfaces were cleaned or destroyed, and this led to the loss of those few physical signs that could have been significant in the first days after the disappearance. Service analyses indicated that such dynamics make it impossible to reconstruct the sequence of events over a long period of time, even with the availability of archival data and primary reports, because the environment itself no longer corresponds to its state at the time of the incident. As a result, the investigation ultimately ran into objective limitations of the infrastructure, the lack of identity, and the loss of traces. These factors were independent of the actions of the personnel and could not be compensated for by additional checks. Thus, the disappearance case within the Metro system was recorded as unresolved for a combination of reasons. The individual entered a technical zone, and the subsequent developments remained hidden within the infrastructure without the possibility of documentary confirmation. Several months after the incident, the case file was re-examined as part of a routine internal review, but no new information emerged. The video footage remained the same, and the physical areas where the man allegedly walked had already been partially maintained and cleaned. Maintenance work inevitably changed the condition of the surfaces, removing dust and moisture deposits, and replacing individual fastening elements, which ultimately ruled out the possibility of matching the traces with the primary finds recorded in the first days after the disappearance. The official documents noted that such changes occur regularly and cannot be suspended for the sake of an investigation, since the priority remains the safe operation of the line and the stability of train traffic. This once again confirmed that time in such cases works against the recovery of events. The infrastructure lives according to its own maintenance cycles, and does not maintain a state sufficient for long-term analysis. Special attention was paid to the issue of a possible human exit from the station through technical shafts, but a repeat inspection of these points revealed no signs of tampering or unauthorized access after the date of the incident. All hatches and exits discovered were closed and showed no signs of recent use, further narrowing down the possible scenarios. Thus, the version of the man's independent exit from the metro system was considered unlikely and was not further developed in the reports. The main working hypothesis remained the continuation of movement within closed technical segments, followed by loss of orientation or entering a danger zone. However, without the ability to accurately indicate the place and time of the incident, this hypothesis could not be verified or documented. At this stage, the investigation finally moved into the analytical plane and was considered exclusively as an example of disappearance within a complex technical system. The analytical reports emphasized that this incident revealed the limitations of existing procedures for recording events in the technical infrastructure. The system was focused on monitoring passenger flows and rolling stock, but not on tracking movements within service and decommissioned areas. Experts pointed out that this imbalance had been created historically. When the metro was designed, it was assumed that access to such areas was only possible for personnel, meaning additional controls were considered excessive. The case of the unknown man showed that this assumption does not always correspond to reality. The presence of physical access without digital recording creates conditions in which a person can find himself outside all surveillance systems. Internal reports have documented that even with full preservation of video recordings and access logs, there remains a significant amount of space where events leave no digital trace. This space is formed from old tunnels, temporary passages, and technical niches that were not included in modern monitoring schemes. The analysis showed that such sections are present on most lines and are not a unique feature of a particular station. However, the absence of repeated incidents did not allow for the justification of the need for urgent changes at the systemic level. Metro management considered the incident to be isolated and not posing an immediate threat to operations. This position was reflected in the final documents and determined the further attitude towards the case materials. The incident has finally become established as an analytical example rather than an active investigation with the prospect of continuation. As the case progressed into analytical mode, the focus of the specialists shifted from attempts to establish the fate of a specific individual to studying the conditions under which such a disappearance was possible, with a primary emphasis on the interaction between outdated infrastructure and modern control procedures. Internal analysis teams analyzed the timeline of events from the moment the man entered the service area until the active searches ceased, recording every point where the system lost its ability to track. This analysis showed that the key gap arose not from a technical failure, but from a lack of monitoring mechanisms in segments that were considered irrelevant and of no interest for exploitation. Experts noted that such zones exist parallel to the main system and are not integrated into a single monitoring circuit, which is why any events within them remain local and do not trigger automatic responses. The reports emphasized that with such an infrastructure arrangement, even the presence of cameras and sensors on the platforms does not guarantee a complete picture of what is happening underground. Analysis showed that the man's disappearance was not the result of a single incident, but rather a gradual descent into an environment where control weakened with each new section. It was also noted that no events occurred during the search that would have affected the train schedule. Dispatch logs contain no entries regarding abnormal stops, alarm activations, or section shutdowns. This confirmed that the incident did not affect the operational portion of the line and remained within the technical segment. For this reason, automatic response algorithms were not activated, the system did not register the situation as an emergency, and therefore did not generate mandatory notifications for external services, and the decision to expand inspections was made manually, and each time depended on access and operational windows. An internal analysis showed that with this control model, a critical event can develop within the infrastructure without any external signs. The line remains operational and appears stable to passengers, while information about the event remains limited to a circle of employees with access to service data. The final report described this situation as a loss of observability while maintaining normal operation, meaning the system continues to function without interruption, even when an event requiring a search occurs within it. And this became the key conclusion of the incident. After the incident materials were transferred to the risk analysis unit, specialists began a detailed reconstruction of the chronology of events, separately recording each moment when the control system lost its ability to track, with particular attention paid to the transition from the passenger area to the service infrastructure and the subsequent data disruption. During the investigation, it was established that the man's route before entering the service premises was fully recorded by surveillance cameras. The recordings contained no omissions or interruptions, which made it possible to accurately determine the time and sequence of his movements along the platform. Once the service door was crossed, video surveillance ceased completely. There were no cameras in that part of the infrastructure, and the access system failed to record the event due to technical issues with the lock. This moment became the key point of loss of visibility. Further analysis revealed that beyond the service area, a network of technical corridors and passages formed during various periods of operation began. A single, up-to-date diagram for them was missing, and some routes were not reflected in digital documentation. This meant that after entering, a man could move in directions that formally did not exist in the accounting systems, and no unit had a complete understanding of their current status and throughput. Risk analysis staff noted that such zones lack control points, presence sensors, and alarms, and that any human movement does not generate automatic notifications in control systems. It was also noted that at the time of the incident, no changes in line operation occurred, no emergency stops, or train schedule deviations occurred, which ruled out the possibility of indirect digital traces of the event. This confirmed that the situation was developing exclusively in the infrastructure segment that does not interact with operational systems and does not affect the movement of trains. The analytical report emphasized that it is precisely these segments that present the greatest difficulty for investigation, since events within them remain isolated from any form of automatic recording. This section was defined as the point after which reconstruction of a person's route becomes impossible without direct physical evidence. After determining the point of loss of observability, specialists focused on analyzing the nearest technical segments adjacent to the service area, checking their configuration, depth, and potential routes for human movement without the possibility of returning to the passenger part of the station. It was found that immediately behind the service door, a sequence of service corridors begins, some of which have a one-way geometry. When moving forward, a person gradually moves away from the starting point without encountering forks leading back. These corridors were designed for technical personnel and did not provide visual landmarks, directional signs, or emergency exits, making them extremely dangerous for unauthorized personnel. Analysis showed that in the absence of a light source and an understanding of the structure of space, a person may not realize how deeply he is moving into the system. Distance is perceived distorted due to identical surfaces and ventilation noise. Internal reports have noted that under such conditions, disorientation can occur within the first few minutes, especially if a person moves confidently without stopping or checking the way back. It was also noted that some of the corridors slope towards technical nodes, which is why returning along the same route requires greater physical effort and may not be obvious without external landmarks. When modeling possible scenarios, experts concluded that a person could pass the point of no return without realizing it, after which any attempt to return would lead to further penetration into the system. In such segments, there are no places to safely stop, no niches to wait for help, and no way to signal, which greatly reduces the chances of an independent exit. These findings were consistent with the inspection results, which showed no signs of chaotic movement or backtracking, and the route appeared linear and directed deep into the infrastructure. Based on this area was recognized as the most likely zone where a critical event occurred, that led to the final disappearance of a person within the metro system. After identifying the likely critical event zone, specialists focused on analyzing technical components located deeper along the route, studying their purpose, condition, and potential risks to a person trapped inside without clearance or protective equipment. It was established that this infrastructure segment contains elements of drainage and ventilation systems that operate autonomously and do not require personnel presence outside of scheduled maintenance. Internal diagrams showed that some of the nodes were located below the main tunnel level and were accessed through narrow passages with limited visibility and no possibility of a quick turnaround. Experts noted that when entering such zones, a person may experience a sudden change in conditions, increased humidity, noise, and a drop in temperature, which affects orientation and physical condition. In the absence of lighting and communication, any further movement becomes unconscious, decisions are made intuitively, and often lead to going deeper into the system instead of returning. The analysis showed that such units lack emergency exits. They were designed exclusively for servicing equipment and do not have escape routes. This meant that after entering this segment, the probability of independent exit tends to a minimum even while maintaining physical activity. The reports noted that similar zones had previously been considered potentially dangerous, but specific measures to isolate them had been postponed due to a lack of incidents. Comparison of this data with the route reconstruction strengthened the version that it was here that the event occurred that led to the loss of the possibility of further movement. On this basis, the site was marked as the end point of the likely development of events within the framework of this investigation. After identifying the probable end zone, specialists began analyzing which specific scenarios could occur within this technical segment. They considered options such as injury, disorientation, or entering a restricted area where independent movement becomes impossible. Particular attention was paid to the condition of surfaces and equipment. Some metal structures showed signs of corrosion and high humidity. In such conditions, even a minor fall could result in injury that would prevent further movement. Engineers noted that this type of node lacks protective fencing. The equipment is tightly packed, and the passageways are not designed for human movement without special training and protective equipment. During the inspection, areas with uneven surfaces and elevation changes that were not visually marked and not equipped with warning elements were noted. The reports emphasized that in such conditions, the risk of an accident increases significantly, even for experienced personnel, not to mention an outsider. However, any incidents in such zones are not automatically recorded. The system does not receive signals if the equipment continues to operate normally. This means that a critical event can occur without consequences for the operation of the line and remain unnoticed externally. The lack of emergency sensors and presence monitoring makes it impossible to accurately determine the moment of an incident. As a result, the investigation cannot establish either the exact time or the nature of the event that occurred inside the technical unit. All conclusions remain probabilistic and based on environmental analysis rather than direct evidence. After analyzing potential scenarios, specialists focused on assessing how infrastructure could impact the preservation of any physical traces, taking into account humidity, vibration, and the regular operation of equipment, which over time destroy and erase signs of human presence. Reports indicated that drainage systems were constantly changing the surface conditions of the floor, with water washing away footprints and silt deposits covering earlier markers, making it impossible to preserve route information for long periods of time. An additional factor is the operation of ventilation. Air currents move small objects and fabric, which can cause even personal items to shift or end up in hard-to-reach areas. Engineers noted that in such conditions, any finds have limited time value. If they are not recorded immediately, the likelihood of their discovery drops sharply. As time passes, the infrastructure returns to its normal state, erasing traces of intervention as well as traces of maintenance. The memo noted that a repeat inspection of these components months later would not yield comparable results, because during this time, scheduled maintenance had been carried out, The configuration of temporary ceilings had been changed, surfaces had been cleaned, and fastening elements had been updated. All of this inevitably disrupts the original context and makes an accurate comparison with the initial inspections impossible. It was also noted that in drainage segments, the regular flow of water and vibrations of equipment lead to the natural displacement of small objects. If personal belongings or fragments of fabric fell into such areas, they could fall into lower compartments or become stuck behind grates, where detection requires complete dismantling of the structures. For this reason, the case file emphasized the limitations of a reinvestigation. Without a body or identifiable objects, standard forensic procedures cannot be launched, and any new hypotheses remain untested because the environment does not preserve traces in a stable form. The summary report indicated that all collected data represented a set of indirect signs. Video recording was limited to the passenger area. Access logs did not contain door-opening events, and physical traces inside the tunnels were incomplete and interrupted in the area where surfaces did not retain prints. Based on these circumstances, the investigation was assigned an analytical status without any practical prospects, and the materials were transferred to storage with a note regarding the possibility of returning to them only if external information emerged that could establish the man's identity or confirm his subsequent path. After the case was assigned analytical status, specialists continued a detailed analysis of the time intervals between key events, paying particular attention to the period from the man's entry into the service area to the moment when the absence of an exit was first recorded as a deviation from the standard scenario. An analysis of duty logs showed that during this period, station personnel did not receive any signals requiring an immediate response. The system operated normally and did not record any accidents or parameter deviations. This resulted in the initial stage of developments being left without active intervention, which was later recognized as one of the factors in the loss of primary traces within the technical infrastructure. The official documents noted that such a delay was a consequence of the regulatory logic, according to which the absence of a formal incident does not allow for the launch of extended search procedures. By the time the man's failure to exit the service area was recognized as a deviation from the normal scenario, sufficient time had passed for the technical environment to change, and scheduled ventilation and drainage work had already been completed, which inevitably affected the preservation of possible physical traces inside the tunnels. Service reports indicated that any traces of contamination from footwear or contact marks on surfaces under such conditions have an extremely limited lifespan. Equipment vibration and humidity quickly destroy the primary context and make a repeat inspection less informative. The analysis showed that during the period between the man's initial entry and the expansion of the search area, some of the passages were serviced, individual elements were cleaned or replaced. These actions were carried out in a routine manner and were not considered interference with the investigation. This led to the route reconstruction becoming dependent solely on archival data and indirect signs recorded at an early stage. New physical landmarks within the infrastructure were absent. Internal documents emphasized that such loss of trace information is a systemic feature of underground technical facilities. They are not designed to maintain the state of the environment unchanged. Particular attention was paid to the role of time as a critical factor. Every hour of equipment operation reduces the likelihood of reconstructing the events, especially in areas with active air and water movement. For this reason, experts concluded that further examinations without the emergence of new introductory information will not lead to clarification of the circumstances of the disappearance. An additional analysis focused on access to technical segments, revealing that the physical accessibility of a number of corridors remains intact even when formally closed, creating hidden routes outside of digital control. These routes are not recorded by cameras and are not reflected in access logs, making any movement within them invisible to the monitoring system. The reports noted that this infrastructure configuration had been in the making for decades and had not been comprehensively reviewed. Changes were made piecemeal without updating the overall picture. This meant that even specialists did not have complete information about the current state of the underground space. The lack of a coherent diagram made it impossible to accurately model the man's route after losing visibility. When analyzing possible scenarios, it was taken into account that a person could continue moving deeper into the system without realizing the limitations on return. The geometry of the passages gradually led him away from the starting point. In such conditions, attempts to return along the same route require significantly more effort and orientation, which is practically impossible to achieve without preparation and lighting. The document stated that such segments do not contain emergency exits and are not intended for human occupancy without special permission. This increases the risk of a situation in which further movement becomes impossible. The absence of alarm signals and line failures excluded the automatic involvement of emergency services. The absence of any alarms or deviations in line operation meant that the system continued to function normally. The control logs did not contain records of non-standard modes, and automatic response algorithms were not activated at the time of the suspected incident. This significantly limited the possibilities for subsequent analysis, since without digital markers, it is impossible to determine the exact moment when the situation transitioned from normal to critical, and the infrastructure did not record the incident itself. Service reports emphasize that such cases are the most difficult to investigate. The system only responds to events that affect operation, while events occurring in isolated technical segments remain outside the scope of automatic control. As a result, a critical event could develop without any external signs, without affecting train traffic or triggering protective mechanisms, making it invisible to most services. An additional complication was that the lack of an established identity precluded the use of standard search tools, and it was impossible to check for social, medical, or professional factors that might influence a person's behavior. Without this data, the investigation was deprived of personal context and was forced to rely solely on technical analysis of the environment and indirect signs. The analytical materials noted that under such conditions, it was impossible to form a verifiable version of events. Each hypothesis remained an assumption not supported by material evidence. For this reason, further development of the investigation was deemed inappropriate without the emergence of new external information capable of changing the initial input data. At this stage, the case was finally confirmed as an unsolved disappearance within the Metro's technical infrastructure, with no established identity or confirmed mechanism. After the case was finally marked as unresolved, specialists continued internal monitoring of the infrastructure for possible recurring indicators, focusing on similar areas where unstable controls and limited event recording had previously been recorded. To do this, reports on other metro lines were analyzed, comparing cases of unauthorized access with incidents within service areas. However, none of them had such a complete route disruption without subsequent traces. This allowed us to single out this case as atypical, even by the standards of underground infrastructure, since in most similar episodes, it was possible to establish at least partial movement of a person after entering the technical environment. In the incident in question, there was no evidence of the man leaving the official segment, which indicated the closed nature of the subsequent development of events. An analysis of the site's configuration showed that a number of corridors form closed loops and dead-end zones. As a person moves forward, he gradually loses the ability to return along the original route. Such features are not visually marked or accompanied by warnings, making them dangerous even for personnel without sufficient experience working in such conditions. In the absence of light sources and landmarks, a person can continue moving until they completely lose spatial awareness, without realizing that the direction back has become inaccessible. This was confirmed by the results of route modeling conducted on the basis of archival diagrams and primary inspection data. Internal reports indicated that this configuration significantly increased the risk of an accident without the possibility of timely detection. These findings were incorporated into the final analytical materials as a description of the probable mechanism of extinction. After incorporating the findings into the analytical materials, the the specialists further examined the influence of the human factor on the development of events, assessing the extent to which the man's behavior on the platform corresponded to the actions of a person aware of the risk, or, conversely, acting on the mistaken belief that the space was accessible. Security footage showed that before entering the service area, he showed no signs of hesitation or searching for an alternative route. His movements were consistent and not accompanied by pauses typical of disorientation or impulsive decisions. This suggested that the man either had prior knowledge of the structure of the service areas or perceived them as an extension of an accessible route, unaware of the boundaries between the public and technical environments. Analytical reports have noted that such perceptions often arise in systems where visual differences between zones are minimal and there are no clear physical barriers. In the case under consideration, the service door was not clearly marked and was visually indistinguishable from the technical passages used by staff in the presence of passengers. This lowered the psychological barrier to entry and could create a feeling that further progress was acceptable. After crossing this point, any external landmarks disappeared. The environment became uniform and did not give signals about the need to stop or return. Analysis has shown that it is the combination of a confident initial movement and a sharp break in reference points that increases the risk of an uncontrolled deepening into the system. Under such conditions, a person can continue moving much longer than expected, without realizing the extent of the distance from the starting point. These observations were included in the materials as an additional factor explaining the nature of the disappearance without signs of resistance or attempts to exit. After completing the initial analysis, specialists began to refine the timing of the man's movements within the service infrastructure. They compared platform camera recordings with system log data to determine the maximum possible interval of his presence in the area where no recordings were made. Calculations showed that, at a leisurely pace of movement without stopping, a person could travel a significant distance along technical corridors without visually sensing the depth of penetration due to the uniform structure of the space and the lack of landmarks. This meant that the potential incident zone encompassed not just one point, but an entire infrastructure segment, including several corridors and connecting passages, each of which required separate access for inspection. Service reports noted that expanding the search area directly increases time costs and reduces the accuracy of route reconstruction, since each additional section adds uncertainty. Additionally, the influence of the acoustic environment was taken into account. Constant noise from ventilation and equipment distorts the perception of distance and direction of movement, especially for someone unfamiliar with underground infrastructure. In such conditions, a person can continue moving forward without realizing that he is moving away from the starting point. Attempts to return are made too late when orientation has already been lost. An analysis of the corridor geometry revealed that a number of sections have smooth curves without visual markers, creating the feeling of a linear route even as one gradually moves deeper into the system. This configuration significantly increases the risk of disorientation and makes returning along the original path unlikely without external assistance. The documents emphasized that in the absence of light and diagrams, a person quickly loses the ability to assess the distance traveled and the direction of movement. This factor was identified as one of the key factors in the analysis of the likely development of events after the man entered the service area. After establishing an expanded zone of probable route, the group requested a list of all technical passages adjacent to the old segment. Points where a person could have moved to another level or entered a service compartment not marked in the current diagrams were checked, while only the elements being checked were recorded, without constructing theories about motives. When comparing the plans with actual inspections, several discrepancies were discovered. Partitions and ceilings that were not documented were discovered on site, as well as narrow passages left over from previous work. Such changes were not accompanied by an update to the overall plan and could only have been known to a small circle of technical staff. To assess the passability of each disputed section, engineers compiled separate condition reports, which noted the slopes of the steps areas with moisture, and zones with increased noise, since these parameters directly affect a person's ability to navigate and return, especially if they are moving without a lantern and without communication with an external post. At the same time, we checked points where contact with existing utility systems was possible, including cable trays, ventilation chambers, and drainage units. In such areas, even a small error can lead to injury, but there may be no external signs for control systems if the equipment continues to operate normally. During one inspection, specialists discovered traces of a recent touch on the metal surface of a handrail. The traces did not allow for identification, but confirmed that someone had passed through this corridor since the last scheduled cleaning. The discovery was documented with a photo and linked to a route point to prevent any misinterpretation. After the trail was fixed, adjacent branches were checked for objects that could indicate human presence, grates, corners, and joints of structures where small objects often get stuck were examined, but no identifiable objects were found, and this again left the route without a confirmed endpoint. The official materials specifically noted that the absence of fines does not constitute proof of a person's absence. In a technical environment, objects can shift due to water and air flows, as well as fall into closed cavities that can only be accessed through dismantling. Such actions were not carried out due to risks and access restrictions. At the same time, the security service reviewed access and movement logs for personnel in adjacent areas. The goal was to eliminate any accidental encounters with employees and identify potential windows where an intruder could have passed unnoticed. The review revealed no events that would explain the man's appearance or confirm his exit from the system. Following the latest round of inspections, a summary report was compiled listing the inspected areas, indicating the points where observation ceased, and describing the risk factors. The document documented that further progress required extensive dismantling and extended work stoppages in certain segments, which was deemed disproportionate in the absence of new inputs. Based on the protocol, the line's management was presented with a conclusion that the current volume of data does not allow for the location of the individual or confirmation of the mechanism of the incident. The materials are subject to storage and can only be used when new information emerges that will provide identification or point to a specific area for re-examination. A few weeks after the report was issued, the transport police received a missing persons report regarding a man named Kengo Matsui, 34, who lived in the Sumida district. Relatives reported that he had left early in the morning on the day of the incident and had not been in contact. A comparison of the time and appearance made it possible for the first time to link the video footage from the station to a specific person. After establishing his identity, police requested a detailed log of Matsui's phone activity from the network operator. The data showed that the device had stopped registering on the network around the time it entered the designated area. The geolocation was limited, but indicated the central part of the city and did not contradict the subway route. The investigation team received permission to re-examine key technical segments, this time in search of a specific individual. Priority areas within the old tunnel section were identified, as footprints and signs of recent contact with surfaces had previously been recorded there. The operation was planned for nighttime technical windows to minimize impact on train traffic. Before the inspections began, engineers conducted a safety reassessment, measuring oxygen levels and the presence of harmful gases in drainage niches, checking the strength of the decking and the condition of the ladders, as elements could weaken during prolonged inactivity. The assessment results allowed the team to enter only a limited depth without dismantling large structures. During a follow-up survey, an object resembling a plastic keychain was found lodged in a drainage grate in one of the sewers. It was removed and sent for examination. Matsui's relatives later identified the keychain as his. The discovery became the first direct physical confirmation of human presence in the deep segment. After confirming the key fob's identity, the search team expanded their inspection of the drainage system, checking the lower-level grates and channel joints where objects could be trapped. The work was complicated by humidity and the limited space. However, no additional items were found, indicating the possibility of further movement of the objects by the water flow. Engineers determined that this drainage channel was connected to a lower technical reservoir located off the main service route. Access to this reservoir had not previously been considered due to its difficulty. A separate penetration plan was now prepared using safety ropes and portable lighting. During the inspection of the lower tank, fresh marks were recorded on the metal edges of the hatch. They looked like traces of contact with fabric or a glove. There was no direct identification, but it was consistent that the marks were located along the trajectory of movement to a place where debris carried by the water could accumulate. Fragments of dark-colored clothing and a strap resembling a bag strap were found at the bottom of the tank. The items were located in a layer of wet sediment and were partially damaged. They were seized and sent for examination to confirm a connection to Matsui through DNA and material comparison. An examination revealed a DNA match between the strap and the sample provided by the family, confirming that Matsui had indeed reached the lower reservoir. However, the direction of his subsequent movement remained unclear, as two technical channels led from the reservoir, one of which was marked as blocked on the diagrams but was in fact still passable. The investigative team inspected the blocked canal and discovered that some of the fencing had been removed in previous years during repairs and had not been restored. The passage led to a narrow service corridor with no communication and almost no signs of maintenance. This particular section was previously considered inaccessible and not included in standard inspection routes. Footprints were found on a damp surface inside the service corridor. The prints matched the pattern of Matsui's shoes, according to the family, and the prints led toward a side niche where a technical hatch was located below. This hatch had no markings and was covered with a heavy lid. Upon opening the hatch, specialists discovered a vertical shaft with a ladder leading to a lower level. The ladder was in poor condition, with some of the fastenings showing signs of corrosion. According to engineers, descending without a safety net posed a serious risk, consistent with the potential for injury during an attempt to ascend independently. In the shaft, a few meters from the hatch, traces of contact with the wall and abrasions on the rung of the ladder were discovered. The nature of the contamination matched the fabric of the work jacket, indicating that the person had indeed begun the descent and could have lost stability in the damp and low-light conditions. The lower part of the shaft opened into a technical compartment with limited space. A pocket-type flashlight without a battery and a pack of Japanese-brand cigarettes were found there. Matsui's family confirmed that he smoked and carried a small flashlight. The items were seized as additional evidence of the route and time spent in the zone. An inspection of the compartment revealed the presence of a narrow channel leading to a drainage collector that connects to the drainage system outside the station. Access to it does not require the presence of people and has no means of return. This fact became key in assessing how Matsui could have finally disappeared from the accessible space. Engineers calculated that if a person were to fall into such a channel, the likelihood of independent exit was minimal due to the limited height and constant flow of water. Furthermore, the channel contained gratings and drops that could trap a body in inaccessible cavities, which explained why initial examinations were inconclusive without precise directions. After approval, a limited dismantling of one of the lower collector grates was carried out. Fragments of fabric and footwear were discovered deep within. The condition of the finds indicated prolonged exposure to a humid environment. The items were sent for examination and later confirmed to belong to Matsui through DNA testing and a match to the shoe model. Despite confirming the identity of the items, the location of the body could not be determined. Experts concluded that the drainage system could have transported the remains further along the drainage line to segments that are not part of the subway and require interdepartmental access. This conclusion was formalized in a separate protocol for further approval. The final conclusion of the reinvestigation phase was that Matsui voluntarily entered the service infrastructure, progressively delved deeper into technical segments, and likely entered the drainage channel where the accident occurred. The subway system itself continued to operate normally and did not generate signals that would have allowed the event to be detected at the time of its occurrence. After the drainage system's route was confirmed, the materials were submitted to Tokyo's drainage authorities for approval. Since further sections of the canal were no longer subway-related, but rather public infrastructure, access required separate permits and the participation of specialists responsible for the collectors and the outlet toward the Sumida River. Coordination took time. Each inspection point required safety confirmation, gas testing, and work authorization for nighttime hours. The Metro insisted on minimal intervention in the existing system to avoid creating flood risks and disrupting pumping stations. After receiving the permits, the group began examining the monitoring wells along the drainage line, checking grates and settling chambers where objects could be trapped. Inspections were conducted along the route from the station towards the main collector. Fragments of fabric were found in several places, but identification did not yield a clear match. Separately, utility work logs for the period following the disappearance were reviewed, checking for instances of sewer cleaning and sediment removal to ensure that any potential finds were not lost during scheduled maintenance. According to the documents, some work was indeed carried out as usual and could have altered the environment without being recorded by the investigative team. Experts used video cameras on a cable to view hard-to-reach areas, but the view was limited by murky water and debris on the walls, which reduced the likelihood of visually detecting remains. However, it was confirmed that the system contained side cavities and expansions where the flow could drain and trap objects. A metal buckle and a small plastic element were found in one of the waste bins. Their shape suggested they belonged to a bag. The items were seized and sent for comparison. Matsui's family identified one of the elements as part of his belt, but this did not allow them to determine the exact location where the final event occurred. Police noted that further progress would require extensive work, including closures and temporary changes to pumping schedules. Such measures could impact the district's utility system. Therefore, the decision to undertake extensive demolition was discussed separately and considered a last resort with no guarantee of success. Amid interdepartmental coordination, a leak appeared in local media about a person disappearing in the Metro's service tunnels. The publication contained no details, but it caused a stir, prompting the Metro to issue an official statement without disclosing technical diagrams or vulnerable infrastructure points. The line operator's statement emphasized that the investigation was being conducted jointly with police and city services, and that passenger transportation remained safe. The statement was kept as neutral as possible and avoided any acknowledgement of systemic problems in order to avoid panic and questions about the availability of service areas. The Matsui family received official notification of the confirmed route and the probable accident. Legally, this was not considered a final determination of the circumstances, but it provided grounds for closing part of the procedures as a completed phase of the search. The relatives insisted on continuing work in the sewers despite the access restrictions. Following consultations, a decision was made to conduct a limited additional survey of several more drainage points, with priority given to areas where the flow slows and objects could be trapped. The work was carried out under the supervision of engineers and took several nights. However, no direct discovery of remains occurred, and confirmation was limited to items. At the same time, the Metro conducted an internal review of access regulations at the line's stations. First and foremost, they replaced the types of locks on service doors and adjusted the sensor settings to detect not only full openings, but also attempts to move the door. These changes were documented as technical enhancements, without being tied to a specific case. A decision was also made to update the current hidden segment diagrams. To do this, a working group was created consisting of engineers from various periods of operation. They collected disparate paper plans and actual inspection data. The goal was to reduce the number of sections that physically exist but are missing from the digital accounting circuit. Several facilities began installing additional cameras and presence sensors in the approaches to old corridors. Priority was given to areas where access from the platform area was possible. This was technically challenging due to communications and power supply issues, but the work was completed in the most accessible areas to prevent the typical scenario of uncontrolled entry. A separate module on responding to an unknown person in a security zone was added to the security services training programs. Employees were taught that the absence of emergency signals does not mean the absence of a threat. An algorithm was introduced for quickly closing routes and notifying the police early, even before identification. During a subsequent audit, several more stations were identified where old passageways remained partially accessible. Their condition was assessed as moderate risk, but some issues depended on funding and repair schedules. Therefore, the implementation of the changes was staged to avoid shutting down the line or creating technological limitations for operation. We also revised the documentation storage and updating procedures, introducing a requirement to record any changes to temporary partitions and passageways in a central database to ensure future generations of employees remain familiar with the actual infrastructure. This requirement was made mandatory for contractors and internal services. Despite the measures taken, Matsui's case remained legally unsolved, as there was no body and no official confirmation of the time of death. The materials remained in the police's custody as a probable accident, and the subway provided technical advice to the investigation. By the end of 2025, the investigative team had compiled a final set of documents, documenting the confirmed DNA findings and the route through the drainage channel, as well as listing the reasons why further searches within the utility system were deemed limited in their feasibility without large-scale intervention in the city's infrastructure. The final materials emphasized that the disappearance was the result of a combination of the availability of the service zone of the observability gap and the dangerous configuration of the drainage segments, while the metro system continued to operate normally and did not generate signals for the immediate detection of the event, which determined the general nature of this story. After completing the final package of documents, the police notified Matsui's family that the investigation had essentially been completed in terms of establishing the root and probable mechanism of the incident, although the case remained open due to the lack of a body and the inability to document the exact moment of death. The city's public utilities issued a separate report stating that a full inspection of the main sewer would require shutting off sections and changing pumping modes. Such work poses a risk to the area and cannot be carried out without extraordinary grounds. Therefore, further search efforts were limited to spot checks. For its part, the metro completed technical adjustments at the station where the service area was accessed. Door locks were replaced, sensors were configured to register any door movement, and access to the old tunnel was blocked with additional mechanical barriers, with mandatory scheduled inspections. In terms of security, an early response protocol for unidentified persons in the service area has been introduced. Now, even in the absence of emergency signals, the incident must be immediately recorded and the transport police must be notified, with all video recordings and access logs preserved without being overwritten. An internal audit revealed that the main problem was not a single door, but a gap between the actual infrastructure configuration and what was reflected in the documentation. Therefore, updating diagrams and accounting for temporary changes became mandatory for all departments and contractors. Matsui's story was used as a case study in how a person could pass from a public area into a technical environment and disappear without leaving a digital trace, emphasizing the need to seal off the path immediately after entry is detected rather than waiting for a missing person report to be filed. It was no consolation for the family. They received an explanation of the mechanism, but no formal closure. The lack of a body meant many legal and personal questions remained open, and the exact location of Matsui's final resting place was never confirmed. At the end of the year, police added a note to the case file stating that work could resume only if new information emerged. This information could include the discovery of remains in the utility system or information from a witness that could point to a specific area outside the metro. In practice, the likelihood of such data appearing was considered low. The drainage system is constantly being changed and maintained, and any traces are lost over time, so the case gradually moved from active monitoring to archival surveillance. Thus, the investigation concluded with documents and technical findings. The man entered the service door and, step by step, entered the infrastructure segment, where surveillance ceased. Although the route was partially confirmed by findings, the final destination remained hidden within the city's underground system.